One thing that we see when we begin looking at the Meno, which was written a long time ago, about 2,500 years, it's translated from the ancient Greek, um, is that beginning really with Socrates' very dense, um, elusive, and ironic response to Meno's initial question. There's a lot going on here. I'm not going to pretend to know everything that's going on, but I'm not even going to get into the stuff that I do know that's going on in Socrates' response to Meno because, it would lead us perhaps into too many digressions, background. But one thing that I can say when you're reading Plato, especially a dialogue like this, Plato wrote dialogues over decades, so his style changed, his philosophical interest changed. I don't think that his philosophy developed. I don't think it really changed, but it certainly deepened, and his interests got more specific. But one thing, reading a dialogue like this, a fairly early dialogue, is that you have to keep in mind that Socrates is using irony. He doesn't always say what he means, not always. And there's a considerable amount of mockery going on, very gentle mockery, I would say. But especially with a character like Meno, who apparently was a real person, he Plato chose to have this dialogue, with Meno. Who knows if Socrates ever really met Meno or whether they had a conversation like this? But Plato wanted Meno to be the interlocutor. He wanted to be the person who Socrates was talking with. And he surely had his reasons for that. Meno is not exactly the most reputable character, and certainly, as we find, not the best philosopher, maybe one of the worst philosophers, in terms of his willingness and ability to actually do the kind of things that Socrates is asking. But we'll see about that. But the important thing is that Meno asks a fairly straightforward question, and that is, how do I get virtue? Do I get it by having it taught to me? Do I get it by practicing? Or is it neither of those things? Is it something you're born with, comes to man by nature? And Socrates does not want to answer that question, doesn't think he can answer that question. And he gives a very straightforward reason for that. At the end of his response, he says, I know literally nothing about virtue. And when I do not know the quid, a little Latin there, which is totally strange, because this is written in Greek. So the translator was fluent in Latin and Greek. If I don't know the quid, if I don't know the what of something, what something is, how can I know the quale? How can I know the how? Or how can I know the quality of something? That is, if I don't know what something is, how can I know whether or not it possesses a particular quality? So if I don't know what virtue is, how can I know whether it's teachable? The quid would be knowing what virtue is. The quale would be knowing whether it's teachable. So Socrates is saying, I can't answer your question. That is, I can't tell you whether virtue can be taught because I don't know what virtue is. And that starts off the dialogue with Socrates' admission. How ironic he's being, I don't know. That's something every reader has to decide for themselves. But it certainly starts our dialogue off because Meno is a little reluctant to believe that anybody would admit that they don't know what virtue is. And perhaps that gets us to this word virtue, which is a very complex word we're dealing with here because of its history. Virtue is an English word, but it's basically the Latin. A lot of words in English are just Latin with very little changes in spelling. Uh, Virtue is the English or the Latin word. Um, I guess it means virtue, but if you look at the at the actual root of the word vir or vir, it means man, and virtue basically means manliness. But certainly, it's meant to be more than that. It's really a translation of the Greek word arete, which can certainly be translated as virtue. It has perhaps a more expansive definition, a little wider. Arete can mean excellence, and sometimes it's better translated as excellence than virtue to remind us that the Greeks used that word not just to describe moral excellence, but excellences of all kinds. A great horse could have arete as a horse because it was great. A great athlete, arete, excellence. Perhaps a great poet or something like that. So Meno certainly has that wider sense in mind, and you wonder, like, what is he actually looking for when he asks whether virtue can be taught? It's really not clear whether he's asking, "Can I be taught to be good?" or rather, "Can I be taught to be a great man?" Because that's certainly something that the words virtue, virtu, and arete had associations with being a great man, a great leader, a great military leader, a great political leader, of some sort. So it's really not clear, like what even we're talking about here when we talk about virtue. It certainly is a translation of the Greek word arete. It's in English, but it's certainly more or less a Latin word, Latin translation of arete. So it is all very complex. Anyway, Meno is a little surprised that Socrates would admit, that anyone would admit, that they don't know what this is, because it's such a fundamental concept, virtue or being good or being excellent. And Socrates is apparently serious. And this is what starts off the dialogue, because once he kind of convinces Meno that he is serious, that he doesn't know what virtue is, then they can start talking about it, inquiring into it, looking to define it. And that's really how we get started here. And that is the central question of the Meno. What is virtue, or arete? What is this thing? And Plato and Socrates certainly insisting that there's a logical priority to asking that question before asking any question like whether it's teachable, because you would never be able to tell whether it's teachable until you knew what it was. So first order business is to decide what it is, and that's really the subject of the dialogue. And then in this first section of it, the real interest then becomes what Socrates makes of Meno's initial attempt to answer it, which is right here, where Socrates asks, you tell me, forget about what other people say, you tell me what virtue is. And Meno answers here by saying, well, there's the virtue of a man who should be able to administer the state. There's a virtue of a woman who should be able to take care of the household. There's a virtue of a child, a slave, an old person, a young person. There are different, as he says, there are virtues numberless and no lack of definitions of them, for virtue is relative to the actions and ages of each of us and all that we do. So it's a fairly reasonable answer, I think. Well, if you're asking what virtue is, all I can do is tell you, well, the virtue of this person in this situation is to be like this, and the virtue of that person in that situation is to be like that. It's not a terrible answer on the face of it, but clearly Socrates doesn't like the answer and tells him right away it's not the sort of answer he's looking for. He's looking for a different sort of answer. Abe gives the analogy with bees. There are different sorts of bees, but they're not different. They're not different insofar as they are bees. They share some common nature which makes them bees. And they may be big or small, bumblebees, honeybees, but they're all bees of different sorts. And if they're bees and we call them bees, they must be some fundamental essential characteristic that they share, which makes them bees. Well, think of virtue like that. Okay, maybe there are different virtues that people display it in different times, but they all must be brought together, if we call them virtue, by some common quality or some common characteristic, which is that which makes them virtues in the first place. So that's a very fateful thing, and it's been much commented on that Socrates' dismissal of Meno's initial answer is, maybe not quite as obviously true as Plato thought it was, but it's a very fateful thing, because it's the idea that there are certain qualities that things of a certain kind share, and it's these qualities, what Plato would call the eidos or form, those are the things that we're really interested in. Right? We're not, as he says, interested as philosophers in becoming familiar with all the different sorts of bees or all the different sorts of virtues. We're interested in knowing virtue in itself, or the idea of virtue, or the concept of virtue, or the general form of virtue. And that's really what explains to Meno and becomes what what is the target? What is the object of this dialogue? To find out what that common thing is that all virtues, and in this initial conversation, the virtues of temperance and justice come up. That's what we're looking for, and that's the kind of answer that he wants. Not examples of different sorts of virtues, but what is the common underlying essence of all virtue? All virtue. And that's what he wants. And Meno gets it, right? Meno realizes at the end of this introductory section, of this first section, that the kind of thing that Socrates wants. He says, will you have one definition of them all? That is one common definition of all the different sorts of virtues that there are. And Socrates says, yes, that's what I'm seeking. I mean, we've agreed that they must have something in common, otherwise they wouldn't all be called virtues. So Meno gets it. Meno gets, and he gives such a definition. I would say this is the end of the first section when he says, if you want to have one definition of them all, I know not what to say, but that virtue is the power of governing mankind. And as we see, Socrates doesn't think that's correct. Socrates immediately begins to attack it. And it just sounds completely cut out of whole cloth, maybe, but it's in the right form, right? Because he's defined virtue, virtue itself. Whatever it is that underlies all maybe different sorts of virtues, this is what is shared, that this power of governing mankind. Now, so it fits the form. But right away, we can see Socrates will have all sorts of problems with it, and we don't perhaps even understand why he would say such a thing until we remind ourselves of that word virtue in the beginning, that the word arete or virtue means as much, or arete means as much greatness in the sense of great man greatness. Alexander the Great, who hadn't been born yet, or Pericles, or Achilles, or the king of Persia, So that's kind of what I think. That's the kind of way that Meno thinks. When it comes down to it, virtue, excellence, it's really about power. So that might explain why he would give such an odd definition to the word virtue. If we keep in mind the history of that word, it may not be so puzzling.